Good evening. My name is Nicholas Hanle, and today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the systems that we use to protect the brain and spinal cord, the meningeal membranes. The objectives of this presentation are first, to explain the four levels of protection of the brain and spinal cord. Secondly, I'd like to discuss how to distinguish between the three meningeal membranes. Next, we're going to describe the functions of the meningeal membranes. And finally, we're going to look at some medical examples of damage to the meningeal membranes, how they are affected in hydroencephaly and meningitis. First, when we look at the protection of the brain, there are four main layers of protection to the brain and spinal cord. The first is your skull and your vertebrae. These are obviously the most obvious protections, the hard bony structures that physically protect the structures beneath. The next level are the meninges. It's a fun word to say, but they're the membranes that are there for protection, and they have a function in nourishing the brain and stuff as well. Um, we'll talk a lot more about them. That's the main emphasis of this presentation. The third layer of protection around the brain and spinal cord is the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Um, this fluid actually serves like as a shock absorbing protection. So anytime there's a sudden movement, um, it absorbs the shock of the brain and the spinal cord, so they're not bumping up directly against the skull or spinal column, which could damage the nervous tissue. And then the final level of protection in the brain and spinal cord is the blood-brain barrier. This is more of the chemical protection. It prevents pathogens and other chemicals that aren't necessary for neural function. This prevents those things from passing over into the neural tissue, um, while it still does allow vital things like oxygen and glucose to travel through it. So, um, pretty unique and interesting subject there, but that's for a different presentation. So now let's look more at the meninges. The meningeal membranes, their main goal, they wrap, protect, and nourish the brain and the spinal cord. There are three main layers. The outermost layer is your dura mater. The medial layer is the arachnoid mater, and then the inner layer is the pia mater. We will look at those. You can see them in the drawing here. The dark brown area represents the dura mater. The white area here with the cross links is your arachnoid mater, and then the orange little sheath that's kind of connected and directly contacting the brain in this picture is your pia mater. Okay, so we're going to look at each section now, or each level membrane separately in some detail. Okay, so the first one, we're going to start with the outer layer and work our way in. The dura mater is right here. It's this pink layer here. And it's actually a double membrane. So there's two layers here. You see the first layer there, and the second one's actually down here. And at the edge of the graph here, they're connected together. So it consists of two layers, and at certain location, these two layers can separate from each other. And when they do that, they form sinuses or cavities, openings, in which fluid can gather. So the two types of sinuses they form are dural sinuses or venous sinuses. The dural sinuses here tend to be the little smaller ones, and then the venous sinus would be where this number 5 is, which it's a little larger. Um, the roles of these sinuses is to collect blood and fluid, um, and then once it's collected there, it can empty into the sinuses, return to the heart, and continue with the flow. Cerebral spinal fluid can also collect in this place where they can be reabsorbed back into the blood and reused. So, pretty important function with the chemical composition of the cerebral spinal fluid in the blood as it travels through the brain and the rest of the body. The medial layer, or between the dura mater and the pia mater, is the arachnoid mater. First, the word arachnoid always makes me think spider, and the reason they call it that is because it's got a cobweb like presentation to it when we look at it. So, in our case, it's the red area here. We don't have a very close up view of it here, but if we go back to that original slide, it was the white, and you can see the little uh, interconnections between them. So, spiderweb type fashion to it. Um, it is a delicate layer with a lot of vascular tissue in it. So it's richly has a bunch of blood vessels and helps with a bunch of things there. Um, the subarachnid space, which is between the red arachnoid matter and the dark red pia mater here, that's generally filled with um, cerebral spinal fluid, and so that's where the shock absorb comes in. Um, we also end up where you have these little projections that stick up into the gaps in the dura mater and project into the dural sinuses. So right here where this blue arrow is, and right there, those are called arachnoid villi, or singular villus. Um, their job is they help with the reabsorption of cerebral spinal fluid across the surface of the villi into the blood that's circulating in the sinuses. So pretty important function keeping things flowing there. Okay, and the last layer of the meninges that we're going to talk about is the pia mater. This is the innermost layer, and like I said in the picture earlier, it's this darker red region here, and the lightish tan color or pinkish color here is the brain. So the pia mater lies directly on there. Now the word pia actually means gentle, and this is the most fragile of the three meningeal membranes. So we got to be a little cautious with that. Um, it is highly vascular, and it has a very close adhesion or adherence to the brain and the spinal cord here. So it's an outer covering, but it's directly stuck to it. Sort of like if you bite into a sunflower seed and you have the inner coating there that's still stuck to the seed. That's what we're looking at here. In certain regions, um, you have a special bond between the pia mater and the ependymal cells, and you actually form cerebral spinal fluid in those places. So the meningeal membranes, the pia mater in particular, does play a role in the production of the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, the functions of these meningeal membranes, the reason we're looking at these is number one, they do protect the central nervous system from mechanical injury. So they're going to work with the cerebral spinal fluid and everything, the cranium and all that. They are another layer of protection there. They also help with the blood supply to the brain and the skull. So this blood-brain barrier is going to function in conjunction with the cerebral spinal fluid and um, the meningeal membranes. These are also placed to contain the cerebral spinal fluid. So the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is where the CSF flows, and we do kind of want to keep that in place. And then, like we said at the end of the last slide, it also aids in the production. The pia mater aids in the production of the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, now that we understand what the membranes are, how they're built, and what their functions are, one of the interesting things to me about talking about the human body is the stuff that can go wrong with it. Okay, so one of the things that immediately popped to my head about when I'm looking at the meningeal membranes is meningitis. I actually had a little cousin who, when she was born, she contacted bacterial meningitis from something in the hospital, and she ended up spending a lot of time in the hospital when she was first born. So, family connection here to this. But meningitis, anything with itis, is inflammation of something. So it's simply inflammation of the meninges. In most cases, that means the arachnoid and the pia mater, so that part of it. Um, Most commonly, this infection or inflammation is caused by a bacterial infection somewhere else in the body, where the infection spreads to the meninges and causes the inflammation. Um, the most common bacteria is the Neisseria meningitidis bacteria or meningococcus bacteria that causes this. Um, the symptoms for this, what I found was interesting. The symptoms can be dependent on age. Newborns are going to present a little differently than an elderly person would. So, in newborns, you see things like fever or hypothermia. They can be lethargic. Um, they don't have an appetite and they're disinterested in eating. Um, they can have a distended stomach or abdomen, and since the bones in the skull have not fused together yet, in infants you can see a bulging of the fontanelle, so the head actually expands out a little bit. So, pretty good giveaway there. In adults, you're going to see you won't see the bulging of the fontanelles or anything really of the head. It doesn't enlarge too much because it's fused together. But you do see severe headaches, vomiting, additional pain, stiffness in the neck and up and shoulder region, lethargy, and you can see confusion and disorientation. Okay, so it's just symptoms are dependent on the age of the person. Um, some of the complications that can result from this um, are hydrocephalus, which we'll talk more about in a second, deafness, delayed epilepsy, um, cerebritis, as well as brain abscess. So lots of complications. And I forgot to mention that the bacterial may be the most common form, but there is a viral form of meningitis. Um, so in the viral form, it's obviously caused by a virus that gets into the system. A lot of neurotrophic viruses, such as poliomyelitis, could lead to this, but other viruses such as mumps, herpes, mono, hepatitis, chickenpox, and measles can travel to the meninges and cause this infection or inflammation as well. Okay, we said hydroencephaly was a possible complication of having meningitis. If you inflame the meninges, it could affect the way it works. And the pia mater in particular does play a role in production of the cerebral spinal fluid. So if there's damage there, it can lead to hydroencephaly. My little cousin that I talked about earlier, she ended up with hydroencephaly and a little bit of loss of hearing because of her battle with the meningitis. But hydrocephaly, literally, it's water on the brain. So is what people view it as, but it's an excess amount of cerebral spinal fluid that builds up in the cranial cavity. And if not relieved and caught, can lead to some pretty devastating things and possibly death. Um, Basically, the increased pressure can cause and damage the brain tissue, and that obviously is not good. Um, the causes of hydroencephaly, it could be a result of a congenital defect that you're just born with. Head injuries and an infection could lead to it, even any type of hemorrhage or tumor. So basically, anything where you collect or impede the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid can lead to an increased pressure, which can cause the hydrocephaly. Um, Treatment for this is there's two options. There's medication and surgery, and it's normally some kind of combination of the two. Medication is designed to control the production of the cerebral spinal fluid. Surgery, the most common surgery for this is the placement of a shunt, a tube that runs from the ventricles in the brain. I think the bottom of the third ventricle is where they typically place it. And this tubing has a one-way valve, so that when the cerebral spinal fluid, when the pressure builds up, it pushes through this one-way valve and relieves that excess fluid to decrease the pressure. Now, what I found was interesting is that there's two ways they can place the other end of the shunt, because they do want the cerebral spinal fluid to be reabsorbed. So they can either place the other end in the abdomen where the cerebral spinal fluid is naturally absorbed in the tissue there, or they can actually place it in the right side of the heart where the fluid is reabsorbed through the circulatory system. Um, my little cousin has had to have, I think she's on her fourth surgery for this now to replace the shunt because one of the major problems with it is you can get infections in the shunt or the mechanisms in there can stop working properly. The valve, they have different um, controls on there, different types of pumps that can work, and if those get impeded in any way, they can cause to have to replace it. So in China, they are running some experiments on their they have antibiotic impregnated shunts catheters. So the tubing is impregnated with antibiotics, and the goal here is most infections occur pretty soon after the shunt is placed surgically. So by putting the antibiotics on, impregnating the shunt with that, you're able to kind of fight off that infection. And so far, they have seen some pretty good results with it. It is definitely something, at least me personally, with my family history here, that we're going to keep an eye on and watch. So, to review our four objectives, number one, we wanted to explain the four levels of protection of the brain. That includes the cerebral spinal fluid, the brain and skull and the spinal cord, the meninges, and the blood brain barrier. So we had those four, and we talked mainly about the meningeal membranes, but all four of them are levels of protection. Number two, we wanted to distinguish between the three meningeal membranes, and we talked about each layer, the um, outer dura mater, the inner pia mater, and then the medial arachnoid mater, and how those are built, what they do, how they look. So we discussed those. We discussed the four main functions of the meningeal membranes to protect the central nervous system from mechanical injury, to provide blood flow or supply to the cranium and brain, space for the cerebral spinal fluid to flow, and as well as help in production of the cerebral spinal fluid. And then we talked about our two medical conditions: meningitis, inflammation of the pia or arachnoid mater, and then hydrocephaly, an increase or excess cerebral spinal fluid that builds up in the cranium, causing increased pressure on the brain, which could lead to bad things. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and here are the references. I hope you have a good night. Thank you.